about that. I couldn't possibly stand in for Clive. Okay, so and in some sense this was just a coincidence that our book, UK Anonymisation Network's book, called The Anonymisation Decision-Making Framework, is about to be published. So as you can see, queues are already forming outside Waterstones in anticipation of this hugely important tome. In fact, it's going to be published as an open access publication. It's going to be available from our website. There will be some hard copies. We are having a print run done. So if anybody's interested in that, having a print version, then drop me an email and we'll stick one in the post to you. We are kind of sending them out into the world, as it were. So what was the purpose of this book? And it's unusual because it had an unusual generation process and its purpose was complex. So the Anonymisation Network came together in order to tackle a very particular question, which was essentially, what is anonymisation? And we realised that the concept had this very fluid life and meant different things to different people, particularly from different sectors and different disciplinary backgrounds and so on. So the network was formed with representation from a wide range of sectors, and particularly we wanted to get lawyers, statisticians and computer scientists in the room together. And the other driver of this is essentially then, how do we tie in essentially technical notions of anonymisation with legal notions around data protection? Because that join was still not at that time obvious. Okay, so there was a network process. We had a series of workshops over 18 months, 2012 and 13, and we essentially deliberated around this particular question: what is anonymisation? And what should anonymisation be if it's to be effective? So those two related questions. Now this led to this notion called the Anonymisation Decision-Making Framework, because what we got from these discussions and the wider discussions with our members, we had 400 organisations in the UK in our membership, again from across all sectors, including a significant input from the privacy activist community. And so we had these workshops and we deliberated this concept, and this led to this framework, which at the time was just a set of ideas. And then we went through a further process of producing a firm set of guidance around the principles that we'd outlined, which could be used in practice. And that's the goal here, to produce something which will be a practical guide to individuals in organisations who have responsibility for sharing data in some way or other and need to anonymise it in order to be able to do that. Okay, so this is the basic framework. It's a 10-point system. Now, I should stress we emphasise this again and again, this is not a checklist. It's a set of activities that are required to have a fully functioning anonymisation process. And these activities actually divide into three sort of phases. So, in fact, these are the underlying principles which drive the framework, and most of these won't be particularly surprising to people in this room, but actually clarify points which came up from our consultation with users of anonymisation processes in terms of thinking about what is necessary to make up a functioning anonymisation process. That's also out of place. Okay, so it's not a checklist, it's a practical tool which can be used for understanding a particular data situation. I'll come to this term again in a moment. And it can also be used at an organisational level for developing anonymisation policy across all activities, relevant activities within an organisation. So it has that attribute of being able to be applied either at the policy level or in respect of a particular set of data, a particular data situation. Okay, so so this is the first stage, so the first 5 points in the checklist. Data situation audit. Now, the essential assertion is you cannot decide, and this is where it ties into legal, you cannot decide whether data are personal or non-personal simply by looking at the data. Okay, that's a really critical element. So you have to consider the relationship between the data of interest and the environment in which that data sits. And this data situation audit considers all those elements. So the environment will partly be legal, there'll be ethical elements to that environment. There'll be a use case which is driving the situation. Okay, so the use case is I want to share this data with this other organisation, or I want to disseminate this data for research purposes or whatever. In there you do actually have to know your data. Okay, so one element in here is that you cannot decide whether your data is only by looking at the data, but you can't do it without looking at the data either. And that, again, will be a particularly uninspiring thing for people in this room, but actually it's surprising how often you come across this particular misunderstanding when you're actually out talking to people in the wild thinking about real data sets. Okay. So that's the audit. So the next stage is the element which will be more familiar to people here. So this is the technical part of the process. And we're quite broad in here. So actually what's included in this notion of risk assessment and control. So we would include the application of privacy models if that's the appropriate tool for the job in this particular situation, the one that we're actually considering. And then the third element, impact management. So this part actually marries on to the discussions about harm that we were having at the end of the last session. And we now consider this to be a really important part of any anonymisation process if it's going to be fully functional. So there's where issues like transparency come up and management plans in place for adverse outcomes. Now, we absolutely assert that you cannot share useful data without some element of risk. That's a sort of fundamental tenet on which we're operating. The implication of that is if you've measured your risk accurately, there is a possibility that something will go wrong by definition. And therefore it's your responsibility not only to minimise the risk, which is clearly a very important responsibility, but also to have in place contingency plans for if those risks manifest themselves. There is a general element of this to do with monitoring the data environment, continuing to think about what the situation is, how it relates to new technology, new data sources and so on. So we're definitely against the release and forget mentality. And identifying who your stakeholders are. So this is the communication plans. Now, numerous anonymisation processes fall down on this one. Okay, so in this country we had care.data as the real prime example. They had some quite good processes up the top end in terms of what they were thinking about doing technically. It wasn't perfect, but they were doing thinking in that area. They were completely misunderstanding what they needed to do here. They hadn't done a proper analysis on it. So that whole potential sharing of data went badly wrong, and I understand has now been shelved. The key concept is this concept of the data situation. So we're constantly looking at two elements, data and environment. How do they relate together? That constitutes the locus of your risk. The risk is not located in the data on its own. So you need to define what your environment is, and we say there are four elements to an environment. There's agents, people, or possibly computer systems that are interacting with the data in some way or other. There's other data, there's governance, and then there's security infrastructure. Now those four elements make up what a data environment consists of. And they can be structured, so data environments can have partitions inside them, they can be layered, and we think about the global data environment as being the biggest level of that, which encapsulates all these micro-environments. And if you're thinking about whether data are anonymized or not, and therefore whether they are personal or not, then you have to consider that relationship. Anything else is going to give you the wrong answer. Okay, so I think that's all of that. So this is an example of a fairly common type of data situation that routinely comes up in our consultancy sessions, where we have an organisation or a set of organisations collecting personal data. They share an anonymised subset with some government agency, and the government agency release some tables out into the open environment. So thinking about these data flows is very important, and it cuts across all of the elements in the framework. So the provenance of the data in terms of legally who has what relationship with these tables that you're releasing at the end here. Each of these moves has some risk associated with it. Each of these local environments has some risk associated with it. So you need to evaluate the risk of the whole process. And some of the chains can be longer than this. So the complexity, for example, of what's being done to under the Troubled Families Programme, which is being evaluated by bringing together data from 4 government departments and all the local authorities in the UK, the governance and the provenance processes for those data is incredibly complicated. And working out where the risk sits and the relationship between different environments, again, is very complicated as well. But this is a necessary part of your process. Okay, so that's me done. Shall I take some questions now? Okay.
Any questions for Mark?
I might talk to an organisation and say, what are your requirements? What do you need to achieve? And they'd say, we need the data to be anonymised. How do you move the conversation forward from that sort of high level into really eliciting what they
okay. The first thing is I never have a conversation. I say, right, that's the wrong conversation to be having now. And I frequently go down through these steps myself. Let's direct and let's describe to me what this data is. What are you wanting to do with it? Who the person at the other end is? How are they going to use it? What's the actual situation? That's the thing you've got to get nailed down first of all. And then you need to think about things like what pieces of legislation apply to those data. Now, when you start having those conversations, usually the other stuff starts to creep round the edges. And what you'll find is people have this tendency to go round and round in circles like a dog chasing its own tail when because they just say, well, there's this thing and there's this element to it, and I don't understand. Tell me what to do. Panic stations. So the point of the framework is to precisely to ameliorate that sort of panic that sets in, where you say, right, this is the first thing you've got to think about. Describe what the situation is. Why are we even having this conversation at all? Lay it out in detail. What data, where are you moving it from to, for what purpose, who's using it at the other end, how are they using it, how many people are using it, and so on. And then you can talk about, once you've got that situation structured, then you can start having reasonable conversations about what it is that can be done to the data. Now, that may vary enormously, because if those environments line up in terms of the risk, so we do a thing called data environment analysis before we do any type of structured work on the data, So you actually do maybe some comparisons. So if it's a share situation, we've got this environment over here. Are you considering that your current situation where the data is sitting right now to be safe? It's a very important question. If they answer no, they say, well, then forget about the share, let's sort this out first. But if they answer yes, well, yes, it's our data, we're looking after it, it's fine. Okay, so there's your gold standard then. So you're now defining this, according to your organisational policy, as safe. That can be a gold standard for thinking about these other environments. Once you've made that, you've carried out that reference, where you go, this comparison, this is safe, this is less safe, or this is safe, this is just as safe, then you know whether you've then got to do something with the data. So it's very much breaking down this kind of broad set of things which tend to end up in a mushy soup in the client's head into different components which you can then reason about what the relationship between them is. That's essentially the process.
Yeah, can I just ask what threat do you think the purpose has in all of that process? So assuming you have the same environment, the same data, same number of researchers, but the purpose changes, how does that affect risk of disclosure and impact?
The purpose, okay, the purpose, well, their relationship between the purpose and ethical considerations and also legal considerations.
Okay, so the purpose is still public benefit, but the specific, the purpose is one that's consistent with public benefit, but the specific question changes. I suppose what I'm moving towards is what in your framework is there that's against reuse of data for other purposes, given that all the other elements are the same?
Okay, I mean there are still other considerations. So we would then need to talk about conception integrity and those sorts of privacy considerations as part of it. So are we using the data in a way that data subjects might reasonably expect us to be doing that? So it's expectations. So that might also frame your considerations. But assuming all of those are neutral for the purposes of argument, then what you're saying is this receiving data environment is functionally equivalent to the data environment where the data currently exists. And therefore, there's some additive risk that you need to take into account. So there'll be an additional set of people operating. So you need to consider that aspect of it. But in terms of how they are operating functionally, they are equivalent. So then you would take a less restrictive approach to risk in terms of what you would then need to do to the data. There's lots of assumptions in there which I was agreeing to, and that we're assuming that all of these things are equivalent. They're usually not, in fact, but assuming that they were all equivalent, then it's a fairly straightforward situation.
Any other sort of questions on this talk? Okay, I think the general questions we'll have at the end. Chris, come up. Oh, and let's thank Mark for his talk, please.
You have to chase Mark. Okay, thanks everybody. So I'm Chris Dibben from the University of Edinburgh. I'm a health geographer epidemiologist, but over the last 10 years, increasingly I've also been responsible for managing the kind of data services that hold the kind of data that you both need to think about linkage, and particularly probabilistic linkage, and also has important issues around anonymity and privacy. And so when I was asked to do this talk, then I'll reflect on that position I've taken. What I intend to do is to think about the issues that have emerged through that management process. And I want to try and problematize some of the issues. And actually, as with Natalie, I felt that they've already emerged quite a bit today. And apologies, I wasn't able to attend yesterday. So again, there's a slight risk that I might cover some of the same materials. But what I want to problematize it maybe not from a mathematical point of view, but really where it intersects with things like public conceptions of what we're doing, legal issues, and therefore how we try and structure that and try and work forward in a a sort of structural solution. So given my area of work, I'm going to focus really on health and social science research and how this interacts in this field. I'm really going to focus on non-consented data because I think that's where these issues emerge. Interestingly, and I think legal people working the legality of this area want to remind us, but I think the research community on the whole takes the consent to use data in quite a broad sense in terms of what we do with the data. So although I'm not going to talk about consented data, I do think we should need to reflect more on these kind of issues for consented data. And as I said, I'm really going to give this some narrative, I'm going to take it from a UK developmental perspective, so really where we are at and why, and hopefully going through that process then raise questions that I hope this programme might address. And I'll finally maybe touch on the kind of new forms of data that is driving this forward in the social and health sciences. Okay, it doesn't need me to remind this group that at the heart of this is this tension between what users want, which is the question I've been asked to address. So what users generally want is access to high utility data, rich and extensive and easy to work with. All the kind of things we're concerned about, particularly when we're looking at issues of re-identification. So on the other side, the balance then is custodian data controllers that really want appropriate control over re-identification. This, of course, is very familiar to this audience, but perhaps I'll just focus on two things that I don't think have been brought up so much so far. And one thing particularly important for me as somebody who's charged with managing access, there's this issue of a sort of a low cost involved with this easy to work with. Now, the way the UK system has developed is very much through what Christine was talking about, the sort of safe setting. And I too am also concerned about the lack of a common nomenclature to describe this, because I think it does create difficulties. And I'd be keen maybe this programme might be to try and maybe work on a common language. But what we run into a lot of problems then is this idea of people having to move to safe settings. And the risk there is, obviously it sometimes incentivises risky behaviour if you can only work on the data in a safe centre, then you're incentivising all those things we don't want people to think about, which is perhaps trying to break our rules in some way to maintain access to the data. But also, probably more importantly, given that there's a large investment and a cost to these kind of research facilities, we run a risk of having low use. So these restrictions then mean that this data on the whole is underutilised. There's the loss then to just science and understanding it doesn't work, but also funders start looking at this kind of work and question its efficiency and cost value. The other important thing I just want to flag, and I'll return to this, really is this idea of public confidence in what we're doing, and really the need to communicate and be able to communicate some of the very complex things that is discussion in this workshop and within this programme. Because after all, within the kind of frameworks we've already heard about today, often you're actually relying on the public, an individual, to make some kind of choice or to act in some way within that process of maintaining a comfort with what we're doing. And that can be difficult. Okay, so the kind of stage that I'm talking about then in the UK, but it's happened in many places around the world. Countries that have taken having a particular similar course include Australia to Canada to the UK. So it's this movement away from traditional study designs where you would recruit for experiments or bring people consented into surveys. And in the UK that's produced very rich forms of research data. There's a very nice book by Helen Pearson on the cohort studies in the UK, which is a very rich source of information. Where for almost each decade from the 1940s onwards, we have a new cohort that we can study and understand all these life course processes. But of course, what these new forms of data, I'm talking here about administrative data, more kind of found data, so data that is being produced by things we're interacting with that can now be used for research, sort of digital traces or footprints, now open opportunities to both develop new forms of study designs, but also, for example, to replicate cohort designs. I'll talk a bit more at the end about what we're doing with administrative data and cohorts that raise some interesting questions about linkage and also about re-identification and anonymity. It's probably useful, though, to reflect that actually this isn't entirely new. So, for example, the Oxford linkage study actually started in the 1960s. So this was one of the first programs that actively looked at doing linkage between records. I mean, it seems so obvious to us now that you might want to look at patient episodes, so people's interaction with a hospital, and then deaths. That's always been rather well recorded from the 19th century onwards, really to say something about whether the treatment in hospital actually had helped or maybe even harmed people. But it was really these kind of studies in the 1960s that were first to do it. Now, of course, these early studies were also, interestingly, where some of the early development of probabilistic matching. And I think it's interesting, actually, that certainly in how it's applied maybe more routinely in the structures that are doing linkages, actually some of them are still largely using the methods that were developed at this time. So it seems like it's really apt to look at more sophisticated methods. Can we do this kind of thing better? Obviously, in terms of this area, then a key part of the world that has really inspires our work in this area is Scandinavia. And of course, there are these very powerful studies. So, for example, the Swedish twin studies, which is the largest twin cohort, twin study, in the world, about 85,000 individuals. And it's just produced a huge wealth of information, particularly on issues, obviously, of heritability. So extremely important. This is a photo. I wanted a photo of the twin studies, and I found this interesting story that a twin who was a ferry captain decided in 1977 to bring a whole set of the cohort over to Felixstowe. Hence, this is the headline of the newspaper. Interestingly, he said that the local newspaper reported that bizarrely they were all wearing the same kind of clothes, but he did. The person writing the article felt that their exposure to the boutiques of Felixstowe might mean they buy different clothes for everybody. But I've been to Felixstowe, and I'm not sure that's where you'd come for a day trip to extend your clothing range. And of course, this kind of study is now being continued in Scandinavia. So many of you will have picked up the story about autism and your risk of premature death. And this study that actually estimated that there was a 20-year difference gap in life expectancy for people who studied, who experienced autism compared to the general population. And this, of course, was based on Swedish data, again, the Karolinska Institute, where over a 20-year period, they identified people who were experiencing autism, found a match group in the population, followed up, and both the match group and the study group, and found this very large difference in risk of death of something like 2.5 times in the general population, much higher in groups that, as termed in the literature, low functioning autism. And of course, there's a wealth of examples of where linked data then can be useful. So, for example, in the UK, then there's a really highly used permanent linkage between prison data, unemployment benefits, and work-related information. So this enables the production of periods of people's lives with episodes spent in employment and unemployment, custodial services, sentences, so that's prison sentences, non-custodial. And this, of course, allows interesting questions about different kinds of sentencing, the risk of imprisonment, and actually how you avoid people carrying out a crime in the future, perhaps through social policies. Now, this is the one reason I picked this up was that, interestingly, we're attempting to replicate this in Scotland, and going through the process of permission then it's interesting that the privacy bodies that are looking at this are particularly concerned because of the nature of this aspect of the linkage. And so this is really to highlight this point about the differential sensitivity to different data and whether we should integrate that then into our decision making and our understanding of the risks around re-identification. Interestingly, when we've taken this to panels of the public, actually, although they express some concern, equally they have a concern that important work in this area and the avoidance of harm to society more generally is threatened by not allowing these kind of linkages. So another interesting question is, can we integrate into our decision making then that kind of utilitarian kind of relationship? My own work actually started in the 1990s in this area, linking again administrative data to produce small area measures of deprivation. So this was identifying individuals in need and then aggregating these for small areas. Then this was used to make decisions on things like funding, and has been used for about 20 years now by the UK government. So here's London, the red is more deprived, more in need of funding. Now this work actually came to, in terms of our wider research use, to a grinding halt in the mid-2000s. And this is because in the UK we had one of these classic unforeseen events that had very little to do with the research use of this data, but had huge ramifications for this area. And this was because there was an apparent event, I'll explain why I say apparent, where our agency that deals with social security benefits apparently lost 25 million children's records. So this is children receiving a child benefit, which is a universal benefit paid for all children. So in other words, all the children basically in the country that data was lost. The sort of repercussions, the massive fallout of this meant that really this work in this area was stopped really and for 3 or 4 years, and really took a longer period than that to recover. I mean, what's interesting is that actually probably those records were never lost. I suspect it was probably just a clerking process, that somewhere there was ledger that these records had been reproduced and put onto CD, but probably they had never been, because there's never actually been a recovery of those CDs or anybody claiming that they've found them. But really what I wanted to highlight here then, again in our trying to, can we build this into the way we look at privacy and anonymities then, is the importance of public confidence and the loss of it, or perhaps certainly the perception of those that control the data, the loss of the data. And this actually is as important as the actual events. As I said, I think nobody ever provided any evidence that these records had actually been lost. A very similar kind of event that Mark has just alluded to is the care.data system in the UK, which was the national endeavour to link primary care data with secondary care data for a numerous set of purposes, including research, but also including for use within the service. Importantly also, there wasn't a restriction that this couldn't be used for commercial purposes. Now what was interesting here was that this process was entirely lawful. According to our data protection laws, the way the data was going to be held and structured was perfectly lawful. So, and yet we had this whole system that, despite a huge amount of investment, was scrapped yesterday. And the reason there was that simply the public mandate for this process was lost. So an entirely lawful process then clearly couldn't go ahead if the public mandate had been lost. So the need to communicate an understanding of what the benefits are. And of course that's difficult in when you're talking about some of these complex processes of privacy protection. Now, following on from the the problems we had from the loss of the child benefit records in the UK. What we set about was a process really of rebuilding confidence amongst the various stakeholders in the process of research in the UK. There was a number of different programmes. The one I was involved in was in Scotland, which was largely based on health research. And within that then, there was a very strong focus then on setting up a set of principles that that captured the extent to which privacy was preserved, and that was communicated with the public. And so there was a very strong a part of engaging with panels of the public and more wide audits. And I think that's meant that we were able to take this forward from this rather highly problematic period through to where the Scottish Government itself accepted the principles that we'd developed within this programme around the protection of privacy and the research use of this data. The next stage of that in terms of the UK's development then was a process that led towards the development of a system that could be used for not just health but for wider social science use. And this was where the Administrative Data Research Network emerged, which is the SRC funded part that I'm the director of the Scottish Centre. There's centres in each part of the UK and within the University of Essex Administrative Data Service. And so now, presently, we have two sort of central systems providing access, research use to this sensitive data and doing linkage between these sensitive data. So for more the social science side, the Administrative Data Research Network, and within the health and medical research, the FAR Institute, which is the Medical Research Council funded part. Now, on the whole, what has happened is that we've taken the model that Christine was talking about this morning, which is the safe setting approach. Now, as was discussed this morning then, what we follow then is this, and again, I'm not so comfortable with the terminology, the 5 safes. I noticed on our website we just have 4. So basically, the principle is exactly as Christine outlined, that what we don't have in the research environment then is truly anonymised data. And indeed, I subscribe to Mark's views that probably we should never describe a research useful data set as entirely anonymous. I know that might be controversial. But instead then that by looking at these other 5 principles and structures that we create an environment around the data, then we can be more confident about reducing the risk of disclosure, a risk of re-identification to a suitably low level. Interestingly, I don't think anybody's worked out a system for putting a value on that, which I think is important. I think there's a wide acceptance of this type of model and some idea that it's suitably low. Now, what suitably low is difficult, and I'm really pleased that a number of the talks already have started challenging us to think about what suitably or acceptably low is, because I think that would be very helpful. Yes, so just to refresh you, so the 5 safes is to think about the more traditional thing we'll be talking about in this program than safe data. Safe projects is this aspect that we've already alluded to a number of times, which could you envisage an unacceptable project, not just unethically unacceptable, one that might, for example, reveal people's identity, and therefore a system which, if you're saying the system maintains a suitable level of anonymity, then you might want to exclude that. Safe outputs, which again will be familiar with for people. I'll talk a bit more about safe people and safe environments, because that's kind of what these structures are designed to ensure, and I think there's some interesting ideas around that. But importantly then, what we're arguing is in concert then, for a particular time and place, these obviously aren't they relate to the extent to which you're maintaining these things. Then you might talk, and Mark Elliott and myself and others have started using the term functionally anonymous. So for this time and place then, as a function of these factors, then you can talk about the data being anonymous. although of course in terms of the data itself that's clearly not true in the extent to which it's being held. So the safe environment, then safe people, then again is a function of these kind of forms that have become far more familiar now across the world. So one of the particularly important functions about both producing a safer data but also a safe environment then is a separation of functions. So for example in the UK it's very common now to use a trusted third party for the linkage, the probabilistic linking and indexing. That's separate from the research process. So this therefore separates the need for any one individual to have both the directly identifying information but also the separated from the information on the individual. So separating names and addresses that's needed for the probabilistic matching from maybe their health or educational records. Now this does, although it fulfills this function usefully, does cause problems in some aspects that I think it would be useful for us to think about. And that's particularly the extent to which information on the linkage process can flow back into the research process. So as I said at the beginning, it's still very common for us to use the kind of probabilistic matching techniques that were developed in the 1960s and 70s, which actually do function okay in this system. However, there's very useful work with people like Harvey Goldstein in terms of trying to allow a greater flow of information from the matching process back into the research. So in particular to incorporate some of the uncertainty but also some of the information that will help us uncover and account for some of the biases that are introduced from using a probabilistic matching process. This is very difficult to do with this kind of setup and probably will require some clever thinking in terms of the computer science of it but also the mathematics. So the safe people then is created by what some people have termed a regulated space. So that's a space in which the data exists, but there are other important things that you're very confident about happening in that space. And that's usually around things like the people in that space with the data have particular characteristics. And this often then means you can be confident about their behavior. This may be because you have a process of sanctions against them, or they are of particular character, they're trained and understand, they're of a professional position that then may make you more confident in their behavior. And therefore, these are individuals that on the whole are low risk in regards to any of the things you might be worried about in terms of re-identification. And then secondly, there's often a sense of what you might call an unequal gaze. So that's the extent to which there's the constant possibility of observation in terms of what they're doing. The unequal gaze, of course, comes from Foucault's working with Bentham's panopticon principle. So that's the observation of a prison. But in many ways, a lot of safe settings are trying to incorporate that within their processes. So the chance that either with CCTV or people being around or scrutiny of scripts that are generated by their interaction with a centralized computer, then you can observe what they're doing. That both therefore means that a sanction process can imply, but of course unequal gaze, Foucault's argument is that that's how we regulate society. So it's a very common thing for us that observation of our behavior then leads us to behave in a certain way. Of course, what we don't know is really how much that reduces the risk. And so it'd be very interesting to try and work in trying to put figures on that so we could build a more precise estimation of what our risk is associated with data in these kind of contexts. I won't go through this, but this is the kind of situation that is often trying to be established in a safe setting. So often they're physical buildings. So this is the safe setting in Scotland. It looks a bit frightening and dramatic from that angle. Perhaps that's the kind of cues you want to embed in people when they're using data. As I said, the great problem with this kind of model that I've found is then this cost to an individual researcher in terms of their use of the data, often having to travel distances. And so what we've tried to do is extend that concept in a micro form across the UK, and we have funding from the SRC to push this out. So this is, if you like, creating micro-safe settings. So these are not anything that will hold the data, but will hold a thin client terminal that can access a remote server. But this is as the CCTV image from one of them is a tightly controlled space. So in other words, we're trying to, in a very good Foucauldian way, we're trying to increase our gaze across the research community, and therefore in the same way construct regulated spaces across the UK away from our centres.
So they actually have a camera on them when they're working?
Yes, yes. Yeah. So, and we did wonder whether you might want to, in terms of engaging with the public, actually have this as a live feed. So the idea that then the public becomes your observers, but we decided that might be a difficult thing for people to accept.
Cameras inside these spaces are not that uncommon.
Really?
No.
All the census ones have cameras that run 24/7, and so do the German ones.
Yeah, yeah,
So do the ONS one.
yeah.
Yeah, but it's, I mean, it's right on your.
So-
Presumably it doesn't point to the screen.
that's right, yes, exactly, yeah,
It
yes.
doesn't point.
No,
right
you
on
can't see the
person.
screen. Yeah, no, that's right, yeah, yeah. So we want to be careful about any leakage of information
Oh,
through the
that's true,
CCTV system, yeah. Yeah, but yeah, so we had some concerns about, as has been said, it's very common, and actually in most public transport, you're probably not aware of it, that they are the same kind of systems and regulation of behaviours going on.
Sorry, what's the point of the camera if it can't see the screen?
No, yeah, so it's to watch the behaviour, yeah, so it's to make sure that someone isn't taking pictures of the screen, that they're not writing notes, if that's not allowed, yeah. But and as I said, I think probably the most important thing is the fact of observation rather than actually what may be. But again, this will be interesting to try and understand its effect in terms of risks. So we can build that within our model.
And if they were going on site at that nice
Yeah.
prison that you showed earlier, do they have a camera on their face as well?
Yes, in the roof, yes. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, so the other thing that I think, so I joked about the look of the building, but those strong cues that this is, we expect different kinds of behaviour in these spaces is an important part of that. It's the regulation of space. So it's not unattractive to have that feel, I think, although it may not create attractive buildings.
Could you go back to the, I have a question about the pod. Could you just
Yeah,
go back?
sure.
So is there a camera outside of it?
No, so the idea is that these were based in libraries in universities. So our request to the library is to regulate that space outside. So there are some risks, for example, about, there's various technologies that you can read screens for, but require you setting up an antennae system around it.
Right.
So we'd obviously be asking people to, although we did risk assessment of these things, and obviously that risk it was found to be very low because of the difficulty of getting meaningful information.
And how do you prevent someone, for example, from just walking out and then taking notes?
You mean from their memory?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. No. We wouldn't be able to.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
No system does that.
Trust
Yeah.
Trump's technology.
Yeah. Yes. It's the photographic memory of a person is actually foxes all our systems, doesn't it? Really? Yeah.
I'm surprised you allow windows.
It's
It's not really a window.
no, it frosts automatically. Sorry, as soon as you switch on the power,
It isn't really a window.
yeah, it is a real. Sorry, yeah. Yeah.
Did you franchise the arrangement with those if we wanted to?
Well, we'd be very happy to. Well, we did actually copyright it, but not trade, but only because a company that we employed. This is a prototype. That the company tried to trademark it, and so we suddenly realised we might be in a problem where they're trading on it. But we'd be very happy. We're not going to hold our trademark, so we'd be very happy to talk to and pass on plans for it for other research endeavours. Good. So just to finish then, I just very quickly wanted to go through just some of the issues that are emerging, both for anonymity and linkage in this FAR and ADRN process for us at the moment. So very excitingly, the kind of, in terms of medical science and the kind of information we're now being able to link to research data are things like image data. So here's fetal scan data. Now this of course raises a whole set of issues about how do you measure things and how can you integrate it into research, but it of course has important privacy arrangements, just the amount of information that is within an image data. Rather simply, of course, what consultants have tended to do in the NHS in the UK is they often write the patient's name on the scan image, which is extraordinarily difficult apparently. So we have whole teams of computer scientists trying to work out an OCR way of removing a name that is written over something that is this complex type image data. It's very difficult. Why was I going to say this? Oh yes, yeah. So we're increasingly using then very useful developmental type measures that are collected on individuals. So in the UK then we have a universal service of health visitors that visit children in their first years of life and collect lots of information that is useful for research. For example, developmental measures, so this is measuring growth, motor skills, hearing and communication, and vision and social awareness. Our research is interested in looking at the relationship between pollution, fetal growth, developmental outcomes, and then later life educational outcomes. Just to show you how you can use that relationship, but I want to illustrate a linkage problem. So this is actually linking children forward to their standard grade results. That's the test in Scotland that's done around the age of 16. This scale is up to 40, which is a very high mark. And you won't be able to see, but on this axis then is where a child in that period before the age of 5 was classified as, again, the technically term abnormal. I thought you were going to do a turn. And as you might expect, there's a gradient associated with poorer child development. Now, it may surprise you actually that those that were declared abnormal in these reviews actually still achieve a score that's not much below the average for so-called normal children. That's of course because there's very important selection bias going on here, that those children that really have very poor developmental outcomes will never have been asked to sit that exam. And so there's these very important biases that exist within this system. This is one sort of a function of the system. So unlike a cohort study, not all kids are asked or tested at this. But of course, from the linkage, you have very similar kind of, this is very similar issues of selection biases. So I was just going to say, there's also institutional issues here. So for example, these preschool reviews were differentially taken up across Scotland. So for different periods, you have different geographical periods. So you have often very large, rich data sets, but with these interesting biases that are really quite different to the kind of biases that exist in more traditional data. Seeing as everybody's plugging books, although we're charging for this book, I just wanted to use it to illustrate then the useful work that people like Harvey, Katie Harron, and Ruth Gilbert it has been doing in terms of trying to unpack then and trying to build within our analysis the kind of biases that arrive from probabilistic matching. And on the whole, I'll probably misrepresent their research, so but Harvey I'm sure can talk about it if there's a question on it. On the whole, trying to incorporate not only the uncertainty that arises through probabilistic matching in your final analysis, but also trying to recover information in those near-miss links, which are maybe plausible that it's the same individual or the same entity, and incorporating that information into your final analysis, and therefore correcting your, attempting to correct your analysis for those kind of biases related to probabilistic matching. Now, as I pointed out, as I showed you the model we're using, it's extremely difficult with, say, that separation of function models, thinking about how you might incorporate that information. So it needs us to think about that, and also probably the computational aspects that are quite often quite significant for large-scale linkages, given that often these are over many millions of individuals. in Scandinavia, then, there's been a lot of use of historical administrative data, and that's something we're now looking at in the UK. So this is, for example, using records in the 19th and 20th century of birth, deaths, and marriages. Historical quirks of fate, so in Scotland, in 1932 and 1947, all 11-year-olds sat a cognitive ability test that has already been used on a small scale to look at things like early life cognitive ability and then cognitive aging, particularly risk of neurodegenerative decline in older age, so Alzheimer's and dementia. But now, given advances in data, then allowing us to do this at a much larger scale, so whole cohorts, so 60 to 70,000 individuals. But of course, there's a whole set of issues around once these kind of records are transcribed, linking them together and making textual descriptions of things like occupation and causes of death into a research usable form. There's obviously lots of work in that, but we have already started this work, so we've created an entirely new 1936 birth cohort based entirely on these administrative records, which of course is only possible with administrative data if there wasn't a cohort study started at that age. Also with things like births, deaths and marriages, of course, what it allows us to start thinking about, and this is work involved with Peter in thinking about in terms of linkage, it also allows us to link individuals together into sort of sparse life course, but then individuals to siblings and families, and then the possibility of creating pedigrees. Now, of course, pedigrees raise a set of very important privacy issues similar to genomic data, and of course, interesting new questions that as soon as you have pedigrees or genomic information, actually who is the person that would be consenting or not, whose permission you're seeking about a piece of information, given that any individual in a pedigree has information about other people in that pedigree within their informational set. And given work in Iceland, actually, if you have a pedigree and some genomic data, maybe as little as 10%, through genetic imputation, you can reconstruct much of the genomic data of everybody else in the pedigree. So important questions about, therefore, whose information you're talking about, even when you're talking about an individual and their record. There's important work on geographical location. We run into particular problems when we're looking at things like the impact of air pollution on individuals, where we're looking even within our safe haven to have a geographical location. Now, often you can just link obviously the pollution data, but if you want to do maybe more refined geographical analysis that relies on geographical structures, then at the moment we have an impasse with our privacy panels around the release of actual geographic data, particularly in Scotland where you have remote rural areas, and therefore thinking around spontaneous disclosure. Obviously in terms of GPS data and trace data, there's a whole new sets of issues. And so I think, well, and for example, thinking about how do you aggregate this kind of data to remove the individual from this kind of information and produce something that can be used in research. And I'm not really aware of someone having solved that issue, so I would hope that this is a question that people could take forward. Okay, so just some final thoughts then, and not really trying to summarize something, but just things that struck me as of interest for discussion. So I've sort of emphasized that in the UK, our way of solving this privacy utility tension in terms of academic research then is really through the use of regulated spaces. So having spaces where we acknowledge that this data from a pure data point is clearly not anonymous, but the things we build around that space then creates a sufficient level or a threshold of privacy. But as hopefully I've reinforced a number of times, it would be very useful to get a greater understanding of the actual risks and try and make that a more tractable assessment so we can talk about it. Our legal researchers in our centres have talked about the need for interoperability, and what they mean there is actually development of common language. And I guess there's lots of communities which I think we don't communicate particularly well between, not only within ourselves in terms of the terms we use to describe these things, but possibly very important between different other sets of stakeholders, so the public, data controllers. And therefore, having common languages which particularly we can communicate these very complex things, I think without that, it's going to be very difficult to engage in a meaningful way with the publics, however you define them, in terms of these very complex mathematical issues. Hopefully I emphasised in the UK where a loss of what you might call a public interest mandate was catastrophic. And really, the point to emphasise a lot to us, and through our own experiences then, that it's all very well having an absolute legal basis for what you're doing, very good scientific argument about privacy. But if you lose that social license, then the whole system is likely to collapse. So really, what we're aiming for is then developing and maintaining a public interest mandate in what we're doing. And that means looking at these dual issues of the risk of privacy, but also the benefits of research, but constantly re-questioning that in an ongoing process, and not just assuming that once we've established it once and then that won't have changed. But just a final point then, perhaps often I feel that we're less good at communicating, perhaps the media doesn't pick up so much then, is the public benefit of academic research using this data, and perhaps then balancing the cost to privacy against a cost of not doing something, so a more maybe utilitarian type argument. But that's really just, I guess, one for discussion and debate.
Thank you very much, Chris. Are there any questions on this talk? Comments?
Yeah, I'll ask a question. So, yeah, there were 4 saves. So the output one, I guess.
Yes, sorry, yes, that was the one, yes. The output
So
set.
I wondered if you had any comments about what you do about what people do with the outputs of research that they do.
Yeah, so I think we don't, I think you quite rightly highlighted the problem in this area. So our answer to this in the very service I'm responsible is to have a person judging on a set of categories, so the more expensive, but it takes an enormous amount of time. And I guess they are in some ways just applying heuristics, so rules of thumb. So I do think in terms of making this whole process more cost effective, then methods of perhaps automating that to a greater extent and would be extremely useful. So it's an unresolved issue, I think. But
Or training researchers to do it themselves.
well, no, that's really
Sort
nice.
of idea,
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think we probably explain to researchers we don't expect them to come to us with something that's blatantly disclosive, but I think it's very nice to use your kind of typology to say, explain what they might be looking out for.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, Chris, if I could ask you about what you were saying about public understanding of privacy protection and the extent to which the sort of more mathematical definition might matter. So you mentioned a sort of notion of re-identification, and earlier in this meeting some people have said, well, perhaps we should emphasize other notions of privacy protection to do with, let's say, attribute disclosure rather than re-identification. Does that kind of choice figure at all in how your assessment of the sort of public understanding of what privacy protection is, or is it some of these other considerations about the 5 safes and so on that you've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably because the whole people in an everyday way are sort of engaging this in rather an abstract way. I think I suspect there isn't that level of sophistication. Well, not sophistication, that's the wrong word, but I don't think people are considering this kind of process in that sophisticated way. I mean, you can lead people, you can lead a group through to a deeper understanding, but I suspect that where this has gone horribly wrong. It's some broad sense of an insurance company getting access to my data. It's nothing about, well, can they identify something about me as an individual or understand something about me, or just a simple re-identification. So I think that's part of the problem, is that there's not a busy, we're all busy, we're obviously this is our area of work, but aren't really engaging in sort of that depth. So I don't think there's an understanding of that, whether people be more or less sensitive to those various aspects.
I mean, perhaps just one specific feature of 100% data. So in a survey, you might say, I've decided to take part in that survey, I've consented, and then I'd like to know what the consequences of that are. You're saying this is non-consented data on 100% populations. Yeah. So it's a slightly different issue about whether I am being revealed to be in the data or not.
Yes.
I mean, does that make the identification issue less important?
The fact that it's of the whole population to a member of the public, I think that's an interesting question. Yeah, I think we should be doing research. So I think the sort of public engagement work is increasing in scale and sophistication, but it would be really interesting to look at those kind of issues.
So I think this sort of network solution serves the scientific interests extremely well. I'm wondering if you have any metrics about publications that passed through your system versus publications that used other ways of accessing the confidential data on the same domain versus publications based entirely on open access data products.
Yeah. So I think those don't exist at the moment. I mean, this system's been running for about 2 years, so it's rather early days. But I think it would be important to establish whether there is that actual increase in benefit through these, because these are very expensive systems. And if
a lot of the impetus in the U.S. in economics to do things like this has come from a review of our top flight journals, which revealed that in the 1980s, virtually all the empirical papers that were published using on open access data, to use the modern term for it. Whereas about 80% of the publications in the top journals in the last 5 years have used restricted access data, either because of special arrangements made with a commercial provider, or because of restricted access in the sense that we're using it in this workshop.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, I guess the example of from Sweden, where even with a rather small research community, the number of high hitting in that particular area, particularly medical and health sciences, I think that's indicative of that. That they aren't using aggregate data because they have less easy access to individual data and are producing the major papers because of that in these areas.
Okay. If no other questions, let's just thank Chris again. And,
Enough. A lot hasn't changed in the statistics office when I first joined them back in, 1981, I think. So what I'm going to talk about in this, just to cover, and a lot of this stuff was already covered in previous talks, so I'll probably skim through some of it, but basically in government statistical offices, what are the traditional forms of statistical outputs and how we sort of solved the issues of disclosure risk and data utility for these traditional forms. But in recent years, there's been a lot of discussion about what was basically pretty much ignored in the early years, which is inferential disclosure, kind of touching on this aspects of differential privacy. And sort of in my ideas, where we should be going with dissemination strategies, it's rather odd that government agencies aren't using more modern dissemination techniques, not making more use of the internet, etc., and some challenges and limitations. So, traditional outputs, of course, have been survey microdata. Survey microdata is still released generally into data archives. Back in my days, I remember they used to put the survey data on CDs, and anybody came to the, to the agency would just get a CD of the labor force survey or the health surveys. These days, I think they're generally deposited in data archives, and there is some sort of registration in these data archives if you do want access to data, but pretty much the data is available for social surveys. Business surveys are obviously more similar to sort of census counts. They're a lot more sensitive, especially because they have take-all strata, highly skewed distributions, and they're generally not released. And then traditionally tables were the main features of release in statistical agencies. Census tables were available, hard copy census tables. Very careful design of output variables. Even the ONS to these days, every time a census comes up, has a lot of research around how can we disseminate these tables. And of course, weighted sample counts are typically released. And then the final sort of traditional outputs are magnitude tables, and this involves business statistics. So basically, you'd have tables of aggregates or averages. And so up till now, our sort of STC research has sort of been evolved around these traditional forms of outputs. And again, traditionally, the types of disclosure risks that we were worried about was identity disclosure, because that was sort of in the mandate in terms of our code of practice, confidentiality pledges, right? No statistics will be produced that are likely to identify an individual unless specifically agreed with them. And of course, examples of identity disclosure would come from our survey microdata, where we might identify respondents if they have rare characteristics or rare categories, or if we know some sort of response knowledge if the person is in the survey or not. In a census table where we have 100% population in the census, the identity disclosure would be coming from these sort of very small cells, 1 or 2 in the table. And then we have individual attribute disclosure. So we've talked a little bit about learning something new. So attribute disclosure is about confidential information being learned about a data subject, and obviously for attribute disclosure, there would have to be some sort of identity disclosure as some sort of necessary precondition for individual attribute disclosure. And obviously this is why in survey microdata we're very concerned about identity disclosure, just because typically in a survey you'd have hundreds of variables, and so the minute you identify an individual you get a whole range of sensitive variables that you can learn about that individual. In the census tables, the individual attribute disclosure would come from the 1 on a margin, right? So if I have a 1 inside the table, I would have to know all of the attributes of the individual inside that table to be able to identify that individual, or maybe even identify myself. But once I have a 1 on a margin, then I can learn something new about that individual. So it's basically about the structural zeros. It's actually the zeros in census tables that are the problem in identification and attribute disclosure. Another issue is group attribute disclosure, another type of disclosure risk. Very concerned about this as statistical agencies. The notion of harm. As I said, we had a little chat about that, a little discussion about it this morning. How do you quantify harm? Agencies are very sensitive to the issue of harm. We don't want to sort of inform about some sort of small village that everybody's collecting unemployment, or everybody in that village suffers from, alcoholism or some sort of potential harm. Obviously, in the wake of the 9/11, there was a lot of issues in the U.S. Statistical data about looking for pockets of, ethnic groups. Very, very serious. Agencies are very concerned about that. Although for an individual, you're not identifying an individual, but you are, concerned about the harm and your prestige of the agency, etc. In survey microdata, it's quite difficult to find group attribute disclosure, especially under survey conditions. But in census tables, again, it's the structural zeros that would cause the group attribute disclosure, because I might have, all the cells in a row or a column all zeros, and one cell of 50 or 100. But even so, once the margin is equal to the sum of the cells, that is a group attribute disclosure. So that is a cause of concern. And what has traditionally been ignored many years is, over the years, is this inferential disclosure, right? So this has typically not been discussed in agencies back in, the 90s, early 2000s. And this is where confidential information may be revealed exactly or to a close approximation. So I might have in survey microdata a really good prediction model with a very high R squared, or you might have for census tables disclosure by differencing, right? So in this case now we have a problem where even a total in a census table would be sensitive, because once I can difference one from the other, then the total is now sensitive, and we're, touching on differential privacy, which I'll introduce in a minute. So the notion, but this was always very carefully planned for at statistical agencies, because, census tables are basically hard copied, right? And a lot of careful planning around the variables that defined the tables. There were no overlapping, no nest, everything was nicely nested so that tables couldn't be differenced. I do remember when I worked at the ONS for a while, there was a huge backlog of tailored or pre-specified tables, because manually they had to check each specially requested table to go back to what was previously published, and whether there was issues of differencing. And there was an issue. I think that there was a special request for a table of elderly that live in households. And typically, what's generally published would be elderly, right? Elderly and by geographical area. But once you could take that table and difference it from the more general table, now you've got the elderly that are living in, care homes. So that was very sensitive, lots of small cells there. And that was actually checked manually. And they had this huge backlog. It must have been a good year or two before somebody requested a special table before they actually got it. So as I said, this type of disclosure has largely been ignored, but with the huge demands now for data, and why do I need 2 years to get a specially requested table, there's a lot of effort now to try and modernize dissemination strategies in the statistics offices, at least in my experiences in Israel or in the Office for National Statistics. But just to go backwards a little bit, what were the standard STC methods that we used? As I said, survey microdata, identity disclosure was the main concern. And we did a lot of work there. Well, typically the non-perturbative methods are used. In fact, in Israel, it was against the law to perturb your survey data. It was, couldn't change that. But the idea there to control, put some protection, and was basically to delete the highly identifying variables and coarsen and all sorts of non-perturbative methods like that. Magnitude tables, the concern there is actually attribute disclosure, because these are businesses, so we know that their identities are known. And so disclosure control methods, again, were basically by careful table design in the cell suppression that was discussed a number of times, where you had a primary suppression, but then you had to look for the secondary suppressions to make sure that the value couldn't be recalculated from the margin. And then lots of work on census tables, as I mentioned, even at when I was working at the ONS, I'd spend a good couple years before each census just trying to plan the census tables, because in 100% population data set, you've got all the possible and potential disclosure risks there. So very careful design of the tables, threshold criteria. They wouldn't allow a table to go out if the certain percentage of the, it didn't have a certain threshold of population, or it didn't have a certain threshold of small cells, etc. So lots of rules of thumb. The variables, as I said, were fixed to avoid any sorts of differencing. And in some cases, for example, some of the census form is actually a sample. So in the US, for example, the long form is a subsample. So you get a lot of protection from the sampling. And then traditionally, pre-tabular methods have been record swapping on a very small amount of records. And post-tabular methods, many countries are using rounding and other sorts of methods for protecting the output, actually the counts themselves. So I'm going back to the inferential disclosure. So as I said, agencies have been starting to wake up a little bit, and they need to modernize their dissemination. The users are very demanding now in data, and they're still really behind. I think they still are very much behind. The notion of differential privacy has sort of come to the attention of the statistical agencies, because up to that point, that wasn't really a concern because it had completely different risk scenarios. So I'll explain in a minute. But it was interesting when I first met Cynthia. I was back in, I was a PhD student, so it was, what was it, 2004, 5. And Steve Feinberg organized an amazing week with sort of statisticians and computer science, and it was the first time we even heard of differential privacy. But it was very interesting because the statisticians were on one side and the computer science were on the other side, and they were basically talking to their own communities. But it was an amazing opportunity. And then 5 years later, we had another working group in UC, and it was in Los Angeles. And then all of a sudden, we started talking to each other a little bit. There were a lot of talks that were saying, "Hang on, you know, this is relevant." And we were talking about their wonderful guarantees of privacy, because as you can see, the agencies just do a lot of hand waving. And you know, the computer science had this differential privacy, which is a formal guarantee of privacy. And on the other hand, we as statisticians were saying, well, hang on, you need more utility. And so somehow we were starting to talk to each other. So it's very exciting, and I'm happy that now we've got more opportunity to interact. So what do we mean by differential privacy? Well, this is based on the disclosure of a target unit, where the assumption is the intruder has knowledge of the entire database. And I'm not just talking about the survey, I'm talking about the entire population database, except for one person. So this is not what the agencies, this is not the risk scenario of the agencies. The agencies would have, you know, as you can see, issues of identity disclosure, attribute disclosure. So by all means, give the sufficient statistics, give an average, give a total. You know, we weren't concerned about, you know, that you might get any sort of disclosive information from an average or from a total. And convert, you know, we would develop all sorts of STC methods to make sure that the averages and totals were preserved. And then the computer science people said, well, hang on, you know, that is disclosive. And only when we started recognizing some of these new dissemination strategies, like flexible table generating that Christine talked about, where yes, now we have a problem that tables can be differenced, and now a total is disclosive, where we started to recognize the importance of this literature. So differential privacy, again, agencies, there's key variables or identifiers, there's the sensitive variables, and they're completely, you know, different in terms of how we protect the data. Whereas in differential privacy, there's no such thing as key variables and sensitive variables. Everything is disclosive. The types of disclosure risks, or whether it's from a sample or population, you know, there's no distinction. And as I said, we started to recognize the importance because we're looking at the inferential disclosure, right? This is now coming to the foray, and disclosure by differencing. So back in for the Los Angeles, Chris and I did some work, on, you know, based on the earlier work from the computer science literature. What about the standard practices that we do in statistical agencies? Is it differentially private? You know, what do we do nowadays? And at that time, we wrote a paper looking at a population database and our standard practice of drawing a sample, releasing the sample. Is that differentially private? So again, assuming that the population database is some sort of XU for the population, we draw a sample of XS, and of course we're releasing counts, you know, and those are denoted by little f's, those are sample counts. And if we assume that the intruder knows the whole population database except for one target variable, then we have to define the notion of, we can define the notion of differential privacy, where the probability of the sample counts given the population database is the probability of, you know, F with respect to some sort of SDC mechanism. In this case, the SDC mechanism is the sampling. So, right, so is sampling differentially private? This is something we wanted to look at. And of course, this is the definition of differential privacy for those. I'm sure we've all seen it 100 times. And of course, in the differential privacy literature, the notion of epsilon differential privacy is, you know, is that this ratio has to be below some sort of small epsilon, where the difference between two databases in the population differ by only one individual. And this is really strict, of course, because even the agencies don't know the population database, right? This is really a very strict privacy guarantee for the agencies to consider. And of course, in the literature, in the differential privacy literature, they're adding noise, right? A Laplace noise to all of the queries or the outputs. And the amount of noise would depend on the number of units, but independent of the data. So I'm sure you've all read Cynthia's seminal paper. So in this paper, the question was, is sampling differentially private? And the answer is no. So if the sample count is denoted by little fk and the population counts are denoted by capital Fk, well, once I have sample uniques that could be population uniques, and I move an individual in the population from one cell to another, I might end up with the fact that I have a sample count that's greater than the population count, and that's impossible. So sampling is not differentially private. And in fact, any sort of non-perturbative methods is not differentially private, which I'll get to in a minute. And the question is, well, the agencies are releasing sample data. It's not differentially private. And of course, one of the things that have been going on lately is, as I said, they used to just pass out the data in CDs. I mean, now it is under some sort of controlled, mechanism, data archives. You have to sign up. So there is some bit more control on the sample data. And typically, agencies, there's no such thing as zero risk. And if you think of differential privacy in terms of epsilon delta, there is a slippage. And then we can assess, well, what is the probability that my population unique or my sample unique is a population unique? And I can actually quantify that. And a lot of work we've been doing is about quantifying the probability of this uniqueness. And typically in a data set, you might see 2% or 3%, and agencies will usually allow that slippage in some sort of controlled environment. But in general, sampling is not differentially private. How do we ensure differential privacy? Well, if we assume some sort of perturbation matrix where we're altering the data, and as I said, in some agencies, this is a big no-no to start altering the data. But if we do assume some sort of perturbation mechanism denoted by capital M, and we work through the ratio as in differential privacy in sort of this notation, we actually see that the ratio contains the elements of the perturbation matrix on database XU1, and then having moved an individual target variable to another cell on XU2. Now, if this perturbation mechanism doesn't have any zeros in it, then the perturbation scheme will be differentially private. So now we're looking at various schemes of what agencies do to protect their data, and are they differentially private or not. And as you can already guess from sampling, recoding, coarsening, there's obviously zeros in those mechanisms, and of course those are not differentially private. Data swapping, which is often used, if we were very severe and took every single pair in the census and swapped one another and ensured no sort of zeros in that probability mechanism as I defined it here, then yes, it would be differential private, but in fact we're probably only swapping a couple percent. So, and then PRAM. Sure, yeah.
It turns out that if you restate the swapping problem with just swapping probabilities and conditioning variables, that it's the probability that has to be positive. Even if you only swap 2 or 3%, if there's a positive probability that any record that's got that conditioning set is swapped, then the proof will still.
Thank you for the clarification. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the clarification.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I don't know of any system that's like that, just for the record.
I'm not sure about this differencing. Suppose I want to know your salary. Suppose I know everybody else's salary in the population. And then there's a total in the sample, but then I need to know who is in the sample.
Yeah.
Difference. So it's not enough to know the population. You need to know who is in the sample. Is that correct?
In differential privacy, no.
It's only differencing. Forget different. In differencing that you mentioned.
The differencing, in that case, yes. But when I'm talking about problems of disclosure by differencing, I'm talking about census counts. It's obviously, you know, I've got a lot of protection if you're differencing sample counts.
I think counts or salaries, it shouldn't make a
No, well, anyway, in any you know, variable, but there's a big, sampling gives you a lot of protection, and you have a lot of uncertainty from the sampling. You'd have to know that I was in the file. But when we started looking at disclosure by differencing, it's because we were looking at census tables or, you know, business data or whatever, but 100% data. That makes sense.
If I don't know who's in the sample.
There's no sample. In what she said, 100% data.
Oh,
you
100%
mean no
data.
subsampling?
Oh,
Yeah.
oh. So you're talking all the time about.
What
you're
I'm
talking
talking
about sampling.
no,
Oh,
yes,
you're
I
talking
said
about
is sampling as a disclosure control method. Okay, not the fact that I'm, you know, we do samples because, you know, it's easier than census. As a disclosure control method to release a sample from a whole population, is that differentially private? And the answer is no.
If you know who's in the sample.
No, even without.
Not according to the differential privacy mechanism.
I mean, suppose you're doing a sample and you know the size of the sample, just for simplicity, or you know approximately the size of the sample, and it's an average income question. All right? And now one of the people in your data sets is Bill Gates.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Always Bill Gates.
So
Bill Gates is always a problem.
done so much for privacy research in so many ways.
The point is
really-
that
But for the rest, you have to give the census data.
but my main message is, you know, the purpose of the paper which we presented in UCL, that wonderful was just to see, you know, what other practices, the everyday practices that we do in the agencies, which are fine by our definitions of disclosure risk, identity disclosure, attribute disclosure. We're okay with that, but how does that fit in with this differential privacy paradigm? You know, is it sort of related?
For Bill Gates, I don't need anything.
Yeah.
If he's in the sample, it's big. If he's not, it's small. That's it. Go away.
Since you're taking questions on this section before you go to the next section, I always thought of a subtraction attack as the original form of SDL on my side of the pond, SDC on your side of the pond, that was in Felegi's original paper on the subject, in the 72 JASA paper. So I actually think of it as preceding the classification of identity, attribute, and inferential disclosures. And
Sorry, what was, I missed the first part. What was the Felegi?
the first paper in STC was Felegi's 72 JASA paper, and it was about subtraction attacks. Well, that's what we call them now.
Oh, subtraction, okay.
What you call differencing attacks,
Yes,
the same
yes.
thing. And so, and the methods for making tabular publications safe mostly come from that way of setting the problem up. That was sort of the license to most statistical agencies to go ahead and publish tabular data because they had a system that they could check. Do I have something wrong about the history, or is that?
No, but you precede me, so I wasn't aware that actually the whole tabular, you know, methodology was developed by Felegi in 72. I started the Bureau in 81, so that's
So one of the lessons I've learned as I get deeper and deeper into the statistics is that in the area of official statistics, the first important paper on the subject often has his name on it. I think that's right.
I must have missed something. Okay, so so my message was up to now was this is the traditional, this is what we've done traditionally. We're still doing, hang on a second, we're still doing it, but now we're trying to think of more sort of modern dissemination techniques, and that'll be the next part. Keith, did you want to ask something?
Yeah,
Did you read the Felegi paper in 72?
I was just going to say that, you know, what you're saying is fine, but it's unusual for an agency like ONS just to use one method. It's in 2000, and I'll get my years right. 2001, they used the record swapping, random record swapping, and then felt they had to use the dreadful small cell adjustment in terms of utility. In 2011, they took into account all sort of things like imputed records, none as much was good, and then record swapping and table design. 2021, what we're looking at, which you'll be pleased to know, is to repeat record swapping, targeted record swapping, but also to include an element of the ABS method in the output to do some sort of perturbation. That's only an aim at the moment. You still have to pass this through many levels of bureaucracy before we get this agreed.
That's interesting. Well, ONS is interesting. So when I did my PhD and I paid the rent by working at the ONS for a while, they went through a big exercise because they did some random, before that they did barnardization, which is actually a record swapping on the counts. You know, it's like taking the count, flipping a coin, should I put it up by 1 or should I subtract by 1? And then they realized that in their next census, it's probably doing the same thing to do it, the same result, but we could do it pre-tabular, and then every table that they produce would be consistent, at least, and safe, because there's a lot of inconsistency. But then at the last minute, the national statistician said, I'm not going to release any of these small cells, go away and do some rounding. So instead of the advertised 1-number census, as Ray's sitting there, it became a 3,000 trillion number census, because for every cell that was produced, it kept getting, oh, I got 5 minutes, so we have to close up. Anyway, so, and so this time around they did a targeted record swapping, which is when we're talking about swap rates, by the way, I don't know about the US, but certainly in the ONS, they take into account the missing data and the imputation, so there's a lot. You know, it's really difficult to say what an overall swap rate was because it also takes account the number of rare cases in that particular area. There might be more swapping in one area as opposed to another area, so it was very differential and very targeted. So I have 5 minutes to tell you about strategies. So as I said, the safe data is passé. You know, they have been moving more and more to safe access. The agencies they're waving their hands. They don't know how to protect the data, and they've just been restricting more and more and more access. And so the idea here is to try and use some better dissemination techniques. And of course, this has been discussed, so I really don't have to go over too much. But we're talking about online flexible table generators, certainly for the US American Fact Finder and the ABS for the census tables, to do online flexible table generating. And I worked on the European Union for their census tables. Basically, the input data are these very large hypercubes where they would, every country had to do about 150 of them. Actually, I'd rather drop because I think the countries decided they weren't going to do this. But every country had to do a fixed set of hypercubes. They were all going to go, you know, into some sort of lab in Eurostat, and then everybody could pull off bits and pieces according to the general rules of the package. So just to show you an example, you know, one big hypercube, the general flexible table generator would say something like, well, we'll allow you to take a 3-dimensional table out of these big hypercubes, one variable to define the population. So there's a fixed set of rules of what tables you can release. So as an example of one table, now some work that I did with my PhD student, Mark Elliott, as well, was funded by the Beyond 2011 census, and that was about, well, how do we assess disclosure risk? And I don't have time to get into the fact that the ONS made a major decision in their last census where they decided that the ones are not a problem. It is not the identity disclosure that's a problem, it's the attribute disclosure, it's the margins, it's the structural zeros that are the problem, right? It's not the ones. And so we needed to have a good method for assessing attribute disclosure or basically degenerate distributions, and we used information theory here. So we're using the entropy-based measures, and of course that leads us to an information-based Hellinger distance for the utility, and we did all sorts of risk utility assessments on various methods of perturbation. The interesting thing there is the reason I got kicked off of the Eurostat working group was because I told them they wanted every country to take their 150 hypercubes and to protect them and then send them to Eurostat. And now one country like Estonia said, here's my data, I don't care, you just take it. And one country said, I'm going to suppress everything, so basically they just got margin. And one country said they're going to round everything. And the ONS said they're going to swap everything. So how they're going to actually put some information, be able to get some nice European data, I don't know. And so I said, leave everything in the agencies behind the firewalls and have the package, pull off the bits and pieces on the original data and protect the output, right? This is differential privacy. So that's that last line. You can see that we, have better, lower disclosure risk and better utility if you protect the output. Leave those hypercubes where they are.
And you got kicked off?
Yeah, I got kicked off. And I think the whole thing actually fell. Synthetic data, I won't say anything there because I really ran out of time, and we've talked a lot about synthetic data. Of course, CTA is another method for protecting the magnitude tables, kind of like synthetic data on your business magnitude tables. It's controlled tabular adjustment. Data archives we talked a lot about, so this is becoming a lot more popular, and of course this leads to remote access that Christine has talked about. But some work that I did with Christine was on this remote analysis. Now, agencies are fed up with having to check outputs. And we really need to think about automated outputs that are a priori protective. And so some work that Christine, really good work that Christine was doing through the remote analysis servers. We looked at a data set that Ray gave us on sugar canes in Australia. And we just did standard confidentializing the input as we usually would versus what would come out of a remote analysis server. There are sorts of rules, like they wouldn't use linear regression. We had to use a robust linear regression and all sorts of issues about how we protect the output. So I just have some nice pictures of what the original data looks like, the histogram, this perturbed input, because basically when I perturbed the input, first of all, I had to remove outliers because the agency would not allow. So it looks absolutely horrible against the original data. So it's doing a lot of coarsening plus deleting outliers. And then you have, as a comparison, what would have come out in the remote access, getting these smoothed histograms, but you really get a nice picture. The idea there is no individual point would be allowed, so you can see that you don't get the the minimum and maximum. That would not be allowed in the remote analysis server, but you still get a much clearer picture, I think. And here's a few other pictures of the original, my perturbed input and the confidentialized output. Big differences in the regression parameters that you would get. The little slightly differences because the remote analysis server would use a robust regression instead of the standard linear regression, but huge differences between perturbing the input, perturbing the output. So I became a big advocate. As I said, I got kicked off of this working group, but to protect the output. But it has to be done automatically because agencies just are overburdened with these virtual enclaves and having to check manually these outputs. And finally, residuals. I really like these sequential, did you call them? Parallel box plots to look at the residuals. I actually think they tell a more detailed picture than the original one. And I think you talked about the synthetic residuals in your talk, so that's another approach. So managing disclosure risks recently has just been about restricting access to data. We need to be more modern. We need to have more innovative methods for disseminating government data, especially with initiatives on open data. We need to be stricter and tighter definitions of disclosure risk, learn from the computer science community. It will mean perturbative STC methods, and it will mean that we need to ensure training. How do we cope with measurement error? How do we deal with perturbation in our data sets? And can't strongly advocate enough that we should be releasing the parameters for the noise addition as well. So I'll close there. I'm sorry. I told you I was going to talk a half hour. I talked forever.
Thank you, Natalie. It was very good, kept to time, so thank you. Are there any questions, comments for Natalie, but also we can open up generally now, I think, as well. So, yeah.
So if I understood correctly, which I'm not sure of, then it means that you want to trust Eurostat to get the original data and then perturb it and release.
No, I wanted the agencies to keep the hypercubes behind their firewalls. I didn't want them to send it anywhere. They said in order for me to send my data to Luxembourg, I have to perturb it, or I have to protect it.
What do you mean by perturb the output?
They would
rather
take
than
this
the input?
huge hypercube that's very sparse anyways, and then they would round to base 3.
Who's they?
Oh, the agencies. It depends. Germany was rounding, ONS was swapping, the Italians were suppressing, Estonia was doing nothing.
What is it that you wanted them to do?
I wanted them to not touch the hypercubes, leave them behind the firewalls, that the package, the interface would be to pull up, if somebody says I want to compare Estonia and France, it would be pulled off behind their firewall, would produce the table that they're allowed to disseminate, and then I would protect the table.
But the data was already protected.
No,
I want
original.
to say secure multi-party computing with private outputs,
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right.
privacy protected outputs.
So would the
Two-stage, yeah.
would the national agencies be able to approve that? So in the sense that was there a common set of protocols that all agencies had signed up to for sharing the data?
Well, that was the point of the working group. We were supposed to, the experts, tell all of the agencies how to protect these hypercubes. And they were so big, and to try and protect them in any way would just have totally mucked up the utility. And they don't get the hypercube. They only get a small, two-dimensional table. And those are easy to protect. And then if you're just perturbing these big hypercubes and then aggregating perturbed counts, you can imagine what that does to this table. Just aggregating, overprotecting. Does that make sense?
Any other general questions or comments?
My question is particularly for Natalie and the others who have worked in official statistical agencies. I don't really have a good sense of where different countries are on the spectrum, but I know that the volume of users of the public data produced by the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the National Center for Health Statistics, to hit the big three, is so overwhelming that the idea that we could replace all of that with on-the-fly on-demand calculations that are protected on request, keep track of the releases, appropriately allocate our information publication and privacy loss budgets, doesn't seem tenable in the horizon that I'm working on.
But one of the things I worked on when I was in the U.S., I worked with Jane, what's her name, Goodfellow, at the CDC. Anyways, they wanted to do an online flexible table generator for their NIHR. Is that the name of the survey? National Health Institute? And their problem was very interesting. They wanted to do a table generator because on their public use file, they don't have state. But now, so we did this, lots of perturbation. It's obvious you need perturbation. You need the noise. So every cell had noise associated to it. But the attack scenario there was somebody's got the public use file.
Right.
So that was a very unique problem.
Public use files
yes, can be used as
thinking currently. I agree.
Yeah.
You want to think about housing surveys in Zillow if you're in the U.S.
Yeah.
So if you don't know what Zillow is, a provider of information at the scale of your house on Google Maps. It will give you an estimate of how much it thinks the market value of your house is, and then when you expose your house from public data, it exposes what the tax assessor thinks the value is, what the last transaction price was, because these things are all public information in the U.S. and your address is public information, at least as we currently conceive it. And so existing surveys that have household frames also contain some of this information, and of course the practice in the past was to publish that information with a lot of accuracy. So you want to think about how you operate in such an environment. That's a very good example, I think, of the problematic nature of these public use samples.
But I agree, I'm wishful thinking, but I think the agencies, America's, with the American Fact Finder, that's been around for years, and that's been an amazing.
Being brought down in 2018. So if you need some tables from American Fact Finder, I suggest.
Oh, that's interesting.
Bringing it down, why?
Sorry?
Bringing it down,
because
why?
decade, we replaced the dissemination system with the one we have designed for the upcoming census.
Ah, well, that's
It will be
so it'd be-
replaced by whatever the acronym is CINSI, but even I can't expand it. There might be a half a dozen people at the Census Bureau who can. That is the group charged with ginning up the replacer to American Factory.
But the point is, you know, you've led the way with the, and ABS did some amazing work with their table server, and they have very innovative SDC methods, and
Right.
this consistent key that you mentioned was very, very clever. So all the cells are, anytime I ask for a perturbed table, I always get the same cell if it appears in multiple tables, so then you avoid any problems there. Not like the last ONS census.
Not the last one, the one before.
Yeah, the one before.
I mean,
By 10,000 number census.
in the case of countries that published public use microsamples by methods that were best effort SDC/SDL a decade ago, that they've created user communities that have adapted to the style of publication that basically the second half of the 20th century popularized. And I think this group in particular is well positioned to think about how to transition the user communities into another way of developing confidence in the data analysis that will be feasible given the changed information environment. You can't just say, you've got to do it this way, and trust me, it's just as accurate as what you had before. We all know that doesn't work. So we need alternatives to that method of persuasion.
So we'll hear a little bit about that, about analysis of perturbed data, Ray and Harvey. And
I'm trying to pose a different question.
Yeah.
I think that particularly experts understand how to analyze the perturbed data and know how to do the mathematics and the statistics associated with that. But we are dealing with even sophisticated public users who expect that most of the data that comes out of the statistical agency has been either untouched or only very lightly perturbed, either because we misled them, don't quote me, or because that's actually true. I mean, most of the records on public use microsamples released by the U.S. Census Bureau are the data that was on whatever the survey was that the respondent completed.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's
Surveys,
an expectation, and they've developed methods of doing science that are appropriate for that.
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I guess I'm leaning more towards this. I mean, we're still releasing sample data, even though it's not differentially private, but they are more or less being, restricted in that sense that they have to register in a data archive, where before they just put it on the internet, or the CDs.
The deputy director of the Census Bureau has been trying to restrict access to the public use microsamples that the Census Bureau distributes, but the interpretation of the Freedom of Information Act is that it prohibits that. So,
Interesting.
And so there's a real tension.
But what would be great would be, figuring out what are kind of typical analyses that one would want to do on the data, and then just running them on both in parallel and comparing. That would be pretty
Yes, that would be very useful.
persuasive, I would have thought. And I've also met a lot of users of public use files who don't understand that they're confidentialized. Once they find out, then they want the real data.
Yes, that's the reason that I was commissioned to write the Brookings paper that appeared last spring, because the editor of the journal is the husband of the economist who was on the team that exposed the problem with the 2000 public use microsample from our census and the American Community Survey samples from the middle of the decade, where the disclosure limitation techniques had been improperly applied, and they gave rise to very anomalous distributions of men and women over age 65 that you could detect because the same SDL method had not been applied to the full count tables for the census or to the full sample tables from the ACS. So it was easy to expose the error, and that's of course led to the pretty obvious question: if this is a mistake that you can find, what's going on underneath the watch of the researcher out of our sight?
Ray.
I just wanted to add an Australian sort of vignette to the discussion. I have a colleague who discovered Table Builder for the Australian census results, got very excited, and went off and did lots and lots of very, very, very detailed tables outside the metropolitan areas. And then, proudly informed me that, he could build small area estimates to a degree of accuracy that was unbelievable. And then I said, well, let me have a look at the data. And he showed me the tables. I said, it's very curious, isn't it? A lot of cells seem to have zeros, and then a lot of other cells seem to have 3. And then it sort of got better after that. And I said, don't you see a problem with doing anything with this stuff? And he decided yes, it was a problem. He threw it away.
Well, maybe there certainly has to be good dissemination about the methods that are used. I remember I worked at the ONS, and they were, they even when you're trying to do some research, they don't have access to the census data. They were using perturbed data as well in the ONS. So
That's true inside the U.S. Census Bureau as well until very recently. Yes.
Okay. Anything? Last comments or anything? We can, of course, leave things to the wrap up at 5. Urgent. Okay. Well, let's thank Natalie and all the speakers one more time.